Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another session of LinkedIn Live from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. Fuqua holds LinkedIn Live events each Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern Time. I'll answer your questions at the end, so please put some questions in the comments. I'm David Ridley. I'm a health economist at Duke University. Today's topic is drug prices. Many Americans are frustrated by high drug prices. And with Democrats controlling the policy agenda in 2021, there's the opportunity for change. In this session, I'll tell you a major cause of high drug prices and what we can do about it. Okay, so here's the agenda for the next 30 minutes. I'll give you first give you a very brief background on me. Second, I'll tell you an overview of 3 types of drugs and their prices. Third, I'll tell you the problems. Fourth, I'll tell you a solution. So first, my background. For 20 years, I've been teaching a course on biotech and pharmaceuticals to master's students here at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. I also teach an abbreviated 4-day online executive education course. So just in case you're interested in learning more about this stuff, check out that short course. In addition to teaching, I write papers, and one of those papers became law. It's called the Priority Review Voucher, and you can learn more about it at priorityreviewvoucher.org. Okay, enough background. Let's get into it. So I want to categorize drugs into 3 types. First, retail drugs with competition. Retail drugs with competition. Second, drugs with no competition. And third, drugs administered by providers. So those are different from those retail drugs I mentioned. These are administered by providers. So you can imagine a doctor or a nurse, say, providing chemotherapy. Okay, the first type is retail drugs with competition. I actually think we in the United States get pretty good drug prices for those drugs. In the second and third cases, I'm going to tell you we don't get reasonable drug prices. We get especially high drug prices. But in the first case, for retail drugs, if there's competition, we get pretty decent prices, or at least comparable to what Europeans are paying. Why is that? Because insurers and pharmacy benefit managers are really quite good at extracting lower prices or bigger rebates from those drug makers. Those insurers or pharmacy benefit managers will say, hey, drug maker, you've got competition. We're going to choose one of you or 2 of you. There's 3 drugs in this class. They're all pretty much the same. We think we can steer the business to the drugs that will give us lower prices. So be the one that gives us lower prices. So when there's competition, insurers and pharmacy benefit managers tend to get reasonable prices for drugs, or at least comparable to European prices. That doesn't mean that you're paying reasonable prices. I mean, the insurers, society, the government, they're paying reasonable prices. Your copay might be too high. Your copay is certainly higher than European copays. And we need to think about that, about whether we need to bring down drug copayments. But we'll set that aside for another LinkedIn Live, perhaps. Another day, we'll talk about drug copayments. Right now, we're talking about drug prices, the prices that manufacturers are being paid. Okay, so the first case I said, the problem's not, there really isn't a big problem. But in cases 2 and 3, there's a problem. Okay, so case 2 is drugs with no competition. In some cases, those are drugs for rare diseases, so the population's pretty small, so there's not a lot of entry. In other cases, it's just a really new drug, and the competition is a little behind. So the competition may be a year or 2 behind in terms of entering that drug class. What happens when you have no competition? Well, if it's a drug for a rare disease, that price is going to be very, very high. $200,000 per patient per year, $300,000 per patient per year, $400,000 per patient per year. Why? There's no competition. And so drug makers can almost charge any price. I mean, they're not an infinite price. We can talk later about society and politics constraining those prices to some extent, but those prices can get really high when there's no competition. I would like to see us use cost effectiveness analysis to evaluate those prices. So I'd like to see more use of cost effectiveness analysis. More on that in just a moment. First of all, I want to tell you the third type of drug. So we talked about the retail drugs with competition. We talked about drugs with no competition. The third type of drug I want to talk about is a provider-administered drug. Here, I think the fundamental problem is the way that Medicare pays healthcare providers. I think we have high drug prices for provider-administered drugs. Even provider-administered drugs that have competition, we have high prices. I think the fundamental problem is the way Medicare pays them. And commercial insurers, for convenience, because of norms, tend to mimic Medicare's reimbursement, even pay a little bit more. So I think the problem with provider-administered drugs is the way Medicare pays for drugs. And I have a recent paper, just came out last month in the Review of Economics and Statistics with one of my colleagues who's actually a Duke graduate. C.Y. Lee and I wrote a paper about this problem of reimbursement from Medicare and why it's driving up drug prices. Here's the problem. First of all, I'll explain it in a very simple way and then a little more complicated. So the simple explanation is Medicare is paying based on cost. If you have a high cost, you get a high payment. In this case, if it's a high price, you get a high payment. The reason this is a little more complicated is that it's not Medicare paying drug companies high prices. It's Medicare paying doctors who bought drugs for high prices. So it's not Medicare paying drug companies, it's Medicare paying doctors, or I keep saying doctors, but I mean healthcare providers more broadly, like hospitals and nurses. So the issue is Medicare pays a doctor for the drug that the doctor bought from a drug company. And if the price of that drug was $1, then Medicare pays $1 plus a little markup. So let's say $1.06. If the price of that drug was $1,000, Medicare pays the doctor $1,000 plus a little markup, say 6%, let's say $1,060. So the higher the price for the drug, the more Medicare pays. So the prices are high. Drug companies get this. Drug companies understand the incentive setup here that if the drug's expensive, the doctor will still buy the drug because the doctor will be reimbursed. It's even a little worse than that because if the provider is getting a 6% markup, the higher the price, the higher the markup. So if it's $1 drug, the provider gets 6 cents. If it's a $1,000 drug, the provider gets $60. I actually don't think providers are really motivated by that markup. But I think the problem is that providers aren't unmotivated to stay away from high-priced drugs. I mean, providers are certainly offended by the high prices and will speak out against the high prices, but fundamentally, they'll still use that drug. It's an important drug. And there's not really an incentive for them not to pay a high price because they're going to get reimbursed. And so there's not really an incentive for the drug company not to charge a high price. So the fundamental problem here is we've got reimbursement based on cost, and so there's no incentive for costs not to be high. This is also problematic for patients because in some cases, patients are responsible for paying 20% of the drug price. If the drug's $1, 20% is not a big deal. If the drug's $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, that 20% is a really big deal. So not only is Medicare reimbursement causing us to overspend for some drugs, it's also costing patients a real burden if they're having to pay 20% of the price and it's a really high price. One reason I think there's reluctance to fix this problem is that fundamentally what we're talking about fixing is how we're paying doctors. So what I'm proposing is we pay doctors less. And so you can imagine providers saying, whoa, 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 don't pay us less. We're barely scraping by, especially, look, have you noticed COVID? We're not doing as many knee surgeries. We need some cash here. Don't cut down on our payments. But if we adjust the payments to providers, manufacturers will naturally respond by bringing down their prices. They don't want to leave the providers underwater. So if we pay providers reasonable prices for the drugs, that will force down the prices of the drugs by the manufacturers. Otherwise, the providers won't use it. The providers will decline to use the expensive drugs because they're left underwater. They don't want to lose money every time they inject or infuse a drug. So it's a little messy. I framed it in a pretty simple way. That is, stop paying cost plus. Cost plus leads to high costs. But with that middleman, the provider in there, it makes it a little messier. We need to be able to reassure the providers, we will not leave you underwater. We may need a short-term fix of a few months, keeping providers above water while the system balances out. But in the long run, it'll be really good for providers. They won't have to pay the really high prices of the drugs, because that is problematic for them to pay a lot for a drug now. Yes, they're going to get reimbursed, but it's going to come a little bit later. And also, providers don't want their patients paying that high, that 20% of a really high price. So we need to make these adjustments. Again, I think the solution is to pay not cost plus, but based on the cost effectiveness of the drug. The British do this with some success. They pay for drugs based on value, where they measure value by the quality of life added by the drug, the quality adjusted life years added by the drug. I'm not saying we should be exactly like the British, because the British value a year of life at $50,000. I think that's kind of cheap. So they 20,000 to 30,000 pounds, which equates to about 50,000 US dollars, or actually a little bit less. I think we should assign a higher value to a year of life. So that would lead us to somewhat higher prices than the British are paying. But I think that's important. I think that's reasonable. But we just definitely need to be bringing down those ridiculously high prices that are based on cost plus pricing and are sort of immune to competition in the provider administered space. This problem of payment not being related to a product's value or cost effectiveness is not just limited to drugs. If anything, we actually do better in the drug space. The British do very well in this space, and we Americans are starting to learn about cost effectiveness and adopt cost effectiveness more broadly. But it's not just limited to drugs. We should be doing this across the spectrum. We should be thinking about the cost effectiveness of the products and services we're providing. One final thing I want to say about prices and quality adjusted life years and drugs for rare diseases. I do think there's something to be said for overpaying somewhat for drugs for rare diseases. I think you can make a fairness argument that unless you overpay a little bit, then you're not being fair to those people with rare diseases. We need some special incentives for people with rare diseases, or they won't be served, whether that's overpaying on drugs a little bit, or the Orphan Drug Act helps there, and the Priority Review Voucher Program also helps there. Okay, that's my Drug Prices 101. 3 types: retail drugs with competition, drugs with no competition, and provider administered drugs. Do you have questions for me about drug prices more broadly? I'll let you think about it for a moment, and I'll monitor the chat. So one thing that came up in the Trump administration, which I think was quite interesting, although wrong-headed, the Trump administration said prices in the US should be based on prices in other rich countries, Canada, UK, Australia. So that's a way of reining in drug prices, and is very consistent with Trump's sort of America first, others are free riding on us philosophy. So I understand why this was proposed. But my concern is, if we base prices on US drug prices on the price in Canada, Canada's 3% of the global drug market. The US is 40% of the global drug market in terms of revenue, probably more than that in terms of profit for the US. I mean, the US if we're on average half of the profit of the world, this is an important market for a lot of drug makers. Canada's 3%. So if you're launching a new drug, are you going to launch it at a low price in Canada, which is 3% of the market, knowing that it will undermine your price in 40% of the market, the US? I think not. So the danger for Canada, if the US were to base its price on the Canadian price, is Canada would get higher prices or no drugs. Just a drug company would be tempted to not even launch in Canada if it's going to undermine the US price. Actually, probably the most likely outcome is that that a drug company would sell a drug in Canada at a high price and then rebate off of that, but not publicly. So there'd be a high list price that the US price, the high list Canadian price that the US price would be based on, and then, we'll rebate off of that. We'll provide some clawbacks. The price is going to be $1,000 a dose, but if the spending is above $1 million, we'll cap it there. So I'm skeptical of the Trump administration proposal that U.S. price would be based on prices in other countries, because prices in other countries would not stay the same. They'd go up. At least their list prices would go up. Maybe net of rebates, they'd be lower, but their list price would be higher, essentially hurting people in other countries and just making the system less price transparent, really. So one of the questions that came up in the chat, in the comments, is what are my thoughts on the 340B drug pricing program? So under the 340B drug pricing program, many hospitals, including the hospital just around the corner, are eligible to buy drugs for reduced prices. So I was talking a lot about provider-administered drugs. What I failed to mention was that some hospitals, especially hospitals like this one over here that serve some low-income patients, can actually buy drugs at really low prices. Why is that? The argument is that they should be able to buy drugs at essentially Medicaid prices in order to better serve the poor. This policy came into effect at a time when drug prices to hospitals actually went up as a result of some congressional action. And so Congress tried to remedy that by introducing 340B. Okay, so if I'm a hospital serving some low-income patients, I can pay a nice low price here. Many drug companies are really unhappy about this because they are annoyed that some hospitals are paying 340B prices and being reimbursed much higher prices. And some drug makers assert that some hospitals are buying at those low prices, not just for low-income patients, but for a broader population. So the drug companies have been pushing back, saying, we're going to cut off some of these hospitals that are buying drugs super cheap. In fact, that super cheap Medicaid price can go so low as free, because Medicaid, the price to Medicaid falls as the drug price rises. So if you've had a drug that's been around for a while and you've been increasing your price to society, like to commercial payers, you've been increasing your price to commercial payers, your Medicaid price is going down. There's a penalty for raising your price to commercial payers, and that's Medicaid price goes down all the way to, let's say, a penny. So a hospital might be buying drugs for a penny and being reimbursed at a higher price. It really bugs drug companies. Hospitals say, come on, we need these low prices. This helps subsidize the important work we're doing across the spectrum, including for some low-income patients. Okay, so that's 340B. And I guess the question was, what do I think about it? I'll say that a lot of hospitals are depending on those markups to sustain themselves, to stay afloat, and to help low-income people. But it's not obvious to me that we should be subsidizing hospitals by that drug makers should essentially be responsible for subsidizing hospitals in that way. That's not obvious to me. A question about biosimilar pricing for provider-administered drugs. So biosimilars are generic versions of biologics. It's not quite true. They're called biosimilar for a reason. They're not exactly the same. Usually with generic pills, we think they're really close to the branded manufacturer, to the originator. With biologics, we're talking about living matter. We're talking about proteins. And it's hard to make your product the same as the originator. So rather than calling it a biogeneric, we call it a biosimilar. So we've had biosimilars in the United States. The first biosimilar was approved by the FDA in the United States in 2015. It's about a decade after the Europeans got biosimilars. So we had our first biosimilar approved in the US in 2015. We've had steadily more. I believe in 2019, we had about 10 biosimilars approved by the FDA. So not a huge number of biosimilars. So the reason why I'm telling you this history and saying we don't have that many biosimilars, it may be a little too early to say what's happening with biosimilars, but the evidence so far is, well, it's evolving so fast. It's hard to say. The early evidence, certainly from Teva's biosimilar version of Neupogen, filgrastim, it took none of the market. Now, the second biosimilar for filgrastim, has taken about half the market. So that's decent competition. That's not generic competition. Like in the generic space, the generics after a few years are going to take 90% of the market. Here we have a biosimilar taking half the market. And whereas generic drugs tend to be 80% off the brand price, the biosimilars tend to be 80% of the brand price. So there's not huge savings here. Why aren't biosimilars marking down their prices a lot to attract business? I think it's probably back to the problem I started out with, and that is there's not a huge incentive for providers to purchase cheaper products because they're going to get reimbursed. So why take a cheaper biosimilar if your reimbursement's really not going to change? So if you take a drug up here, you'll get reimbursed here. If you take a drug that's cheaper, you'll get reimbursed here. So there's not at this stage, this is evolving, but at this stage, there's not a huge incentive for providers to take the biosimilar. There's a huge incentive for retail pharmacists to take the generic, for patients to take the generic, a lot of savings. Financial incentives just aren't there yet. This will evolve as competition evolves, as reimbursement evolves, but I'm glad you brought up biosimilars because this is part of the problem with how we reimburse for provider-administered drugs. Yeah, so another question in the chat about, do price controls lead to less innovation? Yes. I believe that incentives matter. I believe that if the incentive is stronger, you'll get more drug development. The question is a matter of degree. If we bring down prices a lot, will we get a little less innovation? And what type of innovation will we lose out on? Let me give you an example, and you can decide for yourself whether we have too much innovation. Drug companies continue to pursue drug development for Alzheimer's disease. I think drug companies are batting about, they're having about one success for every 400 tries. They're succeeding about 1 in 400 times. Those are awful odds. Drug companies fail and fail and fail again on Alzheimer's disease. Is it a waste of time? Maybe so. They keep failing. Why do they keep trying? Well, because if they succeed, they're going to make $20 billion a year, maybe more. So they're willing to throw a couple $100 million at trying to develop a drug, maybe even throw $1 billion at trying to develop a drug, if they think there's going to be a stream of profits for them of 20 billion a year, 20 billion plus 20 billion plus 5 years of 20 billion, you're talking real money. So they're willing to throw $1 billion at trying to develop that drug. So if you are desperate for a drug for Alzheimer's disease, because you have a family history, you have a friend, you have a loved one, maybe you're kind of happy that drug prices are pretty high. On the other hand, it's not clear that we should have these enormous incentives for such low probability events. Maybe we just wait till the science gets a little closer and we start taking some shots again. I'm not sure. That's a tough one. That's an ethical question. It's easy for me to say as a person that, to my knowledge, does not have much history of dementia in our family. If you have history of dementia in your family, you might feel differently. If you have a family member suffering from a rare disease, you're desperate for drug companies to work on a drug for that disease. Maybe you're actually happy we pay $400,000 a year for some of those drugs. So these are some tough questions we need to think about as a society. Okay, so I think I got the questions. Oh, okay, sorry, one more. How has comparative effectiveness policy affected drug prices? So I want to draw a distinction between comparative effectiveness and cost effectiveness. So comparative effectiveness is which one is better, setting aside costs. And we actually do some comparative effectiveness analysis in the United States. PCORI does this. PCORI was created by the Affordable Care Act, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. So we do some comparative effectiveness. Which one's better? We do very little cost effectiveness, or at least the government does. There are some private sector entities doing cost effectiveness, and of course the British do this. And some of my colleagues here at Duke at the Margolis Center do cost effectiveness studies. But our government largely does not. And I believe that using more cost effectiveness analysis would bring down prices and would shift some of the focus of our innovation and help us to be more efficient in this regard. Having said all that, I still want kind of high prices, kind of a high cost effectiveness analysis threshold. I want to value a year of life of a human being of at least $100,000, if not more. And for rare disease, maybe even going beyond that. So I don't want to be as cheap as the British, but I still think we need some mechanism other than cost plus reimbursement to be sure we're getting value for our money. So that's the key here, trying to get value for our money. So some medical doctors in the chat said they have never been paid for prescribing a drug. Okay, I keep saying doctors, I mean providers, but the simple truth of the matter is, so forgive me. Under Medicare, let me be clear, under Medicare Part B, so this is in the outpatient setting, providers are reimbursed at average sales price plus 6% in Medicare plus more in the commercial market. And I realize as most of you, and I don't mean that providers are pocketing all this money. I mean that you may not be aware of this, but your hospital is being reimbursed at cost plus. Now, this is for if you're an oncologist or a nephrologist, I presume that you know this very well. If you're a psychiatrist, you're writing a prescription, somebody's picking up the drug at the retail pharmacy, you are not involved in that at all. So I'm only talking about the provider administered drugs, doctors injecting or infusing a drug under Part B, say in oncology or nephrology, not about you writing a script and sending somebody to the pharmacy, totally separate. That was category 1, remember? Retail drugs with no competition. Oh, okay, I missed another question. Thanks for these great questions, I really appreciate this. Although we're up against, why shouldn't the government, okay, I'm sorry, we're up against it. So it's 1 o'clock. This has been fabulous. I really appreciate your good questions. Let me put in a quick plug for the next talk. So Fuqua LinkedIn Live in 1 week will be Jeremy Petranka. Jeremy's an economist, a dean, a beloved teacher. He'll talk about economic and financial policies that have increased racial disparities and what to do about it. Hey, thanks for the great questions. Thanks again for joining us today. Please be well.